Hello, TV historians. It has been a while. Sorry about that. 2022 has been busy because, after all, every one of us is now taking advantage of everything we did during COVID and lockdown, and we've got new projects right and left. So I will beg your forgiveness that it's been a couple months since I've posted an episode, but let me tell you, this has been worth the wait. We go back a little bit to the roots of advanced TV history, and that is checking in with the tremendous network of academics who love to roll around in the details of TV series, help us connect the dots. And so, of course, what we do here at Advanced TV History is connect the dots of TV and women to American politics and culture. And there is nobody probably more experienced at doing that than our guest today, Dr. Linda Miziewski, who is a professor at Ohio State University. Welcome, Linda, to Advanced TV History.
Thanks so much. I'm so excited to be here.
We are going to talk today about Linda's most current book. She is a prolific writer. You've written a book called The Americans, and it is published by Wayne State University. Tell us a little bit about your publishing career and how you landed with this project just as COVID was starting. Did you get going on it?
Just about. I was trained in film studies and have written a lot about cinema, but a lot of us who started out in film studies have ended up writing about television because television has gotten so good and so interesting. The other thing is that in terms of things like gender and sexuality experimentation and representation, television has always been ahead of cinema because television has multiple sponsors. It can change. If a character doesn't work out, or if a character is especially beloved by fans, they can, switch out a character, bring in a character, give a character more time. Characters can be developed over time. With movies, you have a 2-hour shot, and producers are often reluctant to put a lot of money into a character that might be edgy. And for women, this means, characters who are nonconformist, characters who are queer, characters who are transgressive in some way. I wrote an entire book about the woman detective character in film and in television, and that's a really good example of that. Television was willing to take on the woman investigator character, showing women as pretty serious cops in Cagney and Lacey.
Yes.
Way before film was willing to do that.
Yes.
And with Cagney and Lacey, it was immensely popular. There was some question about running the show, and some people thought that it was too transgressive. They were going to shut down the series, and they got so much fan response. They got so many protests that they hung on to it, and it became a series that won Emmy Awards and became kind of a milestone for the late 1980s. At that time, women weren't doing a lot in cinema in terms of investigations. And for that matter, Silence of the Lambs, which came out in 1991, was a huge hit, a prestigious film. Usually when that happens in Hollywood, when something is so successful, we find a zillion imitations. How many Pirates of the Caribbean do we have?
And anytime Jodie Foster is involved, you definitely you're working with some really progressive subject areas.
Right. And it was prestige, it was popular. However, my point is that there weren't a zillion imitations of this in movies.
Exactly.
We had to go back to television to wait for it to happen.
Yes.
So I'm always interested in how women are portrayed on television because they have a better shot of doing interesting roles.
And listeners, know that actually we did an entire episode on Viewers for Quality Television, which was the organization literally formed at a couple different kitchen tables who launched the write-in campaign and to both the networks and newspapers and media to get Cagney and Lacey and a few other really important series from the 1980s restored. Otherwise, they were going to be canceled. It was all about the ratings game. And these were people who stood in the way and said, the ratings will come. Give these series a chance to build themselves and build the following. And we also know from many other experiences that when a network does want to kill a series, they will move it around the schedule. It'll go from Tuesday night at 8:00 to Thursday night at 9:00. And then all of a sudden it's on Saturday at 7. And that's just sort of their way of saying you're not going to make it. We've just gone down a little rabbit hole, but it's an important one because it kind of brings us front and center to a series that really was quality television. And it isn't that long since it's been made. And that is The Americans. And I have to say that I was doing other things when The Americans was showing on FX TV. But I do love the fact that FX has produced so many different thoughtful and well-performed. There is a high production value to the Americans. So Linda, let's just kick this off with why the series, The Americans, caught your attention and that you decided to sort of package it into one of Wayne State Press's TV Milestone series.
Oh, sure. Well, The Americans, for one thing, as you said, is just really good TV, riveting, suspenseful. And it was doing something that has never been done before. It was a spy series that was set into domestic melodrama, family melodrama. There are kids in the series. There are kids. There's a teenager. There's a little boy is in middle school and in high school. Spies on TV never had families, or if they had families, and even, well, I'm thinking of Alias, for example, where there was, remember, Daddy Spy and Mama Spy and Jennifer Garner. It turns out there was a little family melodrama involved there, but the series didn't revolve around the home space. Mm-hmm. That is, there was a melodrama going on when she finds out that her mother had been a Soviet spy, okay, mm-hmm. and lots of conflict there. But the series didn't take place in their homes. It took place, out there in the world, in offices and on the streets. But with The Americans, I was shocked to see that they were going to do a violent, very violent TV series that was set in suburbia. So, in the pilot, downstairs in the garage that's attached to the home, they have a defector locked into a trunk who eventually is murdered in that garage. The father, Philip, has a conversation with this defector, and then he walks a couple steps into the kitchen and arranges breakfast for his kids and rides to school. This was shocking. This was really shocking. And part of the shock was just these kids are collateral value. So I'll talk a little bit about the setup of the series. The series is based on a real life strategy of the KGB in the 1980s. The KGB sent over some very well-trained agents who had no Russian accents, who were fluent in English and fluent in American culture. And they set them up in the suburbs to work in big places like Microsoft and to gather information. This didn't come out until, I think it was only about 20 years ago, like in the early 2000s, when they discovered some of these people were still here. They were still here. These couples were still there in the suburbs. They had long stopped being spies, but they were there. They were Russian citizens posing as Americans. So the series is based on this real strategy of people who come over posing as Americans. That's the title of the series. They have kids here. The kids are Americans. Mm-hmm. They are Americans. So I was very taken with this and surprised that television was willing to take on these two genres, family melodrama. I mean, family melodrama, a lot of the big scenes here take place when they're, say, watching TV, something very domestic and quotidian, or they take place, around the kitchen table. How could television get away with this? Well, I mean, shocking things really did happen in this series. Right. So that interested me for one thing. The other thing is that I was in the Cold War in a very personal way back in the 1980s. I was a Fulbright teaching American literature in Romania. And this was behind the Iron Curtain, back when Ceausescu was still the dictator. They had always led a number of Fulbrights into Romania because Romania had prided itself on being the rogue state. They were within the Soviet bloc, but really they were the ones who stood up to Russia. And they, for example, sent people to the Olympics in 84 when nobody else did. Well, it turned out that was a front. I mean, Romania was very much a Soviet dictatorship. They wanted Americans there because they wanted our valuta, our hard money. That's about the only reason. And they were very careful to protect students from us. But we had been told that there was a kind of surreal nature of life there for us, in that there was an excellent chance that everything in our apartment was being recorded, that when we had conversations with my colleagues at the university, those conversations had to be reported to the secret police, that only certain people would be allowed to have friends with us. And one Romanian friend told us, she said, "You Americans know almost nothing about what's really going on around you, and it's a good thing you don't. You do not want to know what's really happening." So our entire year there was spent with this kind of surreal nature of knowing that things were not what they looked like, that everything was kind of surreal. There was this layer of deception, around everything. And living that way was really creepy. But it gave us that sense of what life was like in this situation during the Cold War,
Sure.
in which what you saw was an illusion. Well, it turns out that Joe Weisberg, the guy who did The Americans, had himself been a CIA agent. He was a CIA agent in the early 1990s. And it turns out he had gone to the CIA because after college, he traveled to Romania around the same time that I was there. But Weisberg was so horrified by what he saw in Romania that he went into the CIA. Then he got disillusioned. He was in the CIA and realized, whoa, some of the tactics I'm seeing here are about as bad as what the KGB is doing. He got disillusioned and he left. I remember that the embassy had told us, the Romanians think that some of you are spies, and that's the reason why you're going to be looked at very carefully. And you yourself are going to be spied on. And we laughed at that. We thought that was hilarious. Well, by the end of the year, we were pretty sure that actually the Fulbright program was being used by the CIA. We were pretty sure that one among us was a ringer. We never were able to prove it. We were horrified at this, but it also was this little taste of, the other side can use dirty tricks too. So in writing up the series, Weisberg was very aware of both sides, both the KGB and the CIA, going into behavior that was despicable. Now, in The Americans, it's very clear that the KGB is despicable in far worse ways than the CIA is. So, for example, one of the subplots that's based on a real KGB strategy was in West Germany, they had spies from the KGB who would court, romance, and marry a woman who was a secretary in a government office. The whole romance was set up so that this woman would be kind of an insider for this husband who was actually just reporting things that she said. They called it the secretary's agenda. They used this plot line in The Americans. They had Philip, the husband in this American pair, court and romance and marry this American woman who works in the FBI. So it's a horrifying, it's a horrifying subplot, but it's based on real life.
All right. So we're going to delve into the women's aspect of this series in just a second. Listeners, The Americans is definitely worth a try if you aren't overindulging right now on your hard news, because with just so much going on in American politics right now and world affairs, the idea of watching spies that could be like your neighbors I found it a little disconcerting, but it was so well done. The series was so well done and well received by the awards. Those who give awards, like the American Film Institute, honored the producers and the performers and the writers who put together the show with 5 awards from the American Film Institute. Critics' Choice Television Awards, it did very well there. And this was nominated, the series was nominated across many categories. It won 4 Primetime Emmys. It's now many years since it last aired. It debuted in 2013 and ran for 6 seasons. So 2013 to 2019. And it was on FX. It's available on DVD if you hunt it down, and you can also catch it now on Amazon. We do need to delve into the fact that the female spy looks very different in The Americans, even than, the Claire Danes character in Homeland, which is as far along in a series. I think I made it through the entire series. And she was an anti-heroine. She was a tough cookie, Claire Danes. Linda, how does The Americans do the female spy differently? And by the female spy, I guess we have specifically Kerry Russell's character, but there are some other spy characters as well. So talk a little bit about that network of women and how it's done differently. And it feels like it's very much a focal point of this series.
Oh, it certainly is. Elizabeth Jennings that's the Kerry Russell character, is the wife and the mother. And I think a really big difference between this and Homeland is that unlike, in Homeland, the Claire Danes character does eventually become a mother. It's not central to the plot, though, in the way that it's central to the plot of The Americans. One of the things that makes Elizabeth such a controversial character is that she's a mom, okay, who not just, is murdering people for assignments, but she eventually recruits her own daughter to be KGB. And she's really hard on her daughter, too, because she expects her daughter to be a kind of hard-nosed spy that she herself is. Generally, the show treats her motherhood in a much more judgmental way than it treats Philip's fatherhood. They are both shown as full-blown parents, and parenting ends up being crucial to even the suspense of the thing. So, for example, by the end of the first season, the daughter Paige is snooping in the basement, and that's where we know they keep their wigs and passports and guns. And she's kind of curious about why her parents spend so much time down there. Later, they decide they're going to be frank with her, and later in the series, they tell her who they are. She's horrified, and she's so upset that she confides in her pastor about this and blows their cover with this guy. So suddenly the viewers are in this very uncomfortable situation of thinking, whoa, we really kind of like the Jennings, and we don't want the series to end because of this teenager. And we begin to say, is there some way maybe she could be taken out of the picture? It's really awful, the kind of situation to put you into. From the start, Elizabeth is portrayed as the one who's the hardliner, and Philip is the one who is more seduced by the American way of life. It's pretty clear that Philip is based on Joe Weisberg himself, someone who was in the CIA and got disillusioned, because Philip from the very start is kind of attracted to American life in a way that Elizabeth's zealotry is pure. She says, this is materialism. We cannot let our children become American materialists. And meanwhile, Philip is saying, well, we have this really nice house. We have a washing machine. We have things we didn't have back in the Soviet Union.
But the Cold War was sort of a very binary. You are on this side or you are on the other side. And it was perhaps not going to be a woman who was then perceived as soft, who was, to me, the one who would begin falling into the American way and finding the softness between the binary,
Right.
It is a very layered character. The couple character, Elizabeth and Philip. And by the way, did you notice that that's also like Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip of England?
My gosh, that had never occurred to me until this very minute. Years thinking about this series. Oh my gosh, Philip and Elizabeth. Wow, how bizarro.
Yeah, and who knows whether there was ever any intention, their biblical names and everything. But so listeners understand that they were both agents in this program, and then basically were put into a marriage of business. So even the generation of their children and the love that they have as a married couple, that is part of the ongoing saga of this family drama, bedroom drama, trust, a lot of very core components of just good conflict and good fiction come through as a result of a marriage that was never based on love.
A whole lot of people talking about the show, including the writers and the actors and the critics, said this is as much about marriage as it is about spycraft. The chases in the street, the suspenseful scenes, they're filmed like MTV videos with music from the 1980s. Oh my gosh, it's thrilling to watch. But we loved the show, those of us who were fans, because of the family melodrama. Mm-hmm. So when the series begins, even though they are like 14 years into their marriage, Philip and Elizabeth are thinking about this as a business proposition. And they begin to fall in love as the series begins. Elizabeth especially begins to melt a little bit when she realizes, whoa, Philip actually thinks that I am more important than the spy work. And she hadn't been sure of that before. They kind of fall in love, and it's a very sexy series, but lots of good love scenes, lots of good sex scenes. And then of course they fall out of love, they quarrel. Eventually, as the series goes on, it's clear that Gorbachev has come into office, and Elizabeth is very concerned that Gorbachev, he's going to collapse the Soviet Union. He's gone soft, and the KGB is hardline, and they want to do away with Gorbachev. And Elizabeth is with them, like, yeah, let's take down Gorbachev. We who are true Soviets are going to fight to the end to keep the Soviet Union alive. And in the meantime, Philip is thinking, yeah, this is the end. This is the end of the Cold War. Mm-hmm. It's fascinating to watch the history that's portrayed in the show, especially now that we're in another really awful Cold War. It's actually kind of comforting to look back on this one because we know at least how this one resolves. But of course, the show takes us into the lives of the people who were the losers. From the very start, we know they are on the wrong side of history, but they're incredibly sympathetic characters. And I think also you get through Elizabeth a sense of what it's like to be a Soviet patriot, to really take that seriously. And the show gets us into her head
There were two other, so you were speaking about the secretary, who then is sort of brought into one of the melodrama lines and is used. And then there's also another more senior spy. Talk a little bit about those women characters and how the hard-nosed Elizabeth has to interact and what situations she's put in.
Well, her handler is a woman named Claudia, who's much older and who remembers World War II. And through the character of Claudia, we discover, oh, this is why the Soviets are so patriotic. They know what it's like to have been absolutely the ones that suffered the most during World War II. They were the ones who helped so crucially in taking down the Nazis, and they lost so much during World War II. So Claudia's zealotry, of course, never wanes. At the end, Elizabeth has finally come over and thought, well, yeah, actually, things have changed. Claudia never does. She is fierce. And we picks up a textbook, a pictorial history of Russia, and she points to a picture of rubble at the end of World War II. And she says, you see this building? Okay, my family died in this building. She herself, had been around to fight against the Nazis in the 1940s. So we see her perspective, and it's very, very compelling. On the other hand, we have the character of poor Martha. She's the secretary who doesn't even understand that she's a spy. She marries this guy and she believes in him and doesn't realize till much, much later that she's been used by him.
And poor Martha had a hashtag dedicated to her, right? A Twitter hashtag.
Poor Martha, because we felt for her. And, she was not as glamorous as Elizabeth. And she's the one that people could relate to in some way, and that who hasn't been deceived by love, or even scammed by love in the way that she is. She was a controversial character, and that a lot of fans wanted her to die because she was putting Philip in danger when she realized, oh my gosh, I'm in this and I don't want to be in it. So she was at the extreme of really suffering for having been the unwitting spy. And then at the other extreme, we have Claudia, who has been through the war and really understands what Soviet patriotism means in terms of being a patriot from World War II.
Mm-hmm. Again, three different kinds of character. These are women who are central to the storylines. They are not throwaway characters in any way. And the drama, and we're going to get a little bit into some of the technical aspects of the production, but it has a general feel of the mid-'80s when this was all supposed to take place. That from a generational perspective, these women have important parts in the plot. It's not just a series about men. When we think of government and foreign affairs and espionage, we always cue toward men, but this is one where clearly the storytellers realized that this was a chance to shine a light on a part of espionage that we didn't know about. Another way, though, Linda, that it sounds like your work and your research was informed, not just in watching this series, however many times you did. By the way, how many times do you think you watched the entire series?
Oh my gosh. Because I was watching it piecemeal, I would work on one storyline, watch several episodes at a time and watch them over and over again. I don't know, but
the beauty of having done a podcast now for almost 7 years is that the world of podcasting has changed. Just a couple of years ago, Slate, which produces both online content as well as podcasts, brought together the major players in the Americans, or of the Americans, I should say, performers, writers, directors, producers. They really went in depth with that firsthand knowledge, which is something that previously, and you're certainly a scholar, you've been around a long time, it's not often that valuable source of first-hand research is available. Talk a little bit about the podcast.
The podcast is wonderful. It didn't begin with the first year. I think it began the third year that the series was around. And they were able to get the writers, but also sometimes the cinematographers, sometimes the actors, to come in and talk about episodes a week or so after they aired. And sometimes we scholars, when we write about TV or movies, we get so into it and we think maybe we're over-interpreting. Could it be that we're reading too much into it? Well, I'll tell you what, if you listen to any of these podcasts, you realize, no, they really did put a lot of thought and time and effort into the smallest kind of details. So, for example, I found out that In plotting this out, they wanted to keep this in real life time. That is, they were representing years in the 1980s, and they wanted to follow the history of those years. For example, what was happening? How did the KGB react when Reagan was shot? Okay, so they wanted to keep those kinds of big milestones. Or how did people in the KGB react when the TV show The Day After aired? That was a very big event in the 1980s. It was a big anti-nuke movie that was horrifying. It was about what happens to civilians if a nuclear war. And so they devised this huge timeline that they put up in huge pieces of paper all across the writer's room. So not only did they know what was happening historically, and I love this, they wanted to know what was on TV. Like literally, like what time of day did Fantasy Island air, so that it was possible that the kids, if they were around in the living room, that Fantasy Island would be on TV in the background.
On the right day, as opposed to a wrong, it's not a weekday. It's a
exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. But there was this kind of attention to detail in terms of what the show looked like. They went to vintage shops and dug up 1980s kitten heels and sweaters and windbreakers. But they also found someone who was a dealer in Cold War spy paraphernalia, someone who had gone around to Russia after the Soviet Union broke up and bought things like tape recorders and invisible ink. I mean, the stuff they actually used in the 1980s, the cameras, the kind of small cameras that were used for spycraft. So they had this on hand to lend authenticity to it. Also, they tried to borrow the look of 1980s TV. If you ever look at 1980s TV on reruns, oh my gosh, I mean, the filming was it was blurred to us. It looks almost out of focus because we're accustomed to high definition. There was no high definition there. For example, they used some old lenses from the 1980s. And so sometimes you're going to see scenes that are not crystal clear, like it looks like 1980s television. But they went to that kind of effort to be authentic. The music of the 1980s, one of the most brilliant things they did was they realized that MTV had just come into play during the years that they were representing. And so they not only used a lot of the music of the 1980s, but they set up a lot of the action scenes MTV style with that fast-paced editing and artistic editing. It is gorgeous. It's just beautiful TV.
Yes. Yeah. The production value alone makes you want to have it more accessible than it is right now. The fact that it's on Amazon is great, but it kind of deserves to be more run in the mainstream, on one of the big cable channels, as opposed to.
I do wish that it was available in someplace like Netflix.
Yeah.
And Amazon, you have to have Amazon Prime to watch it for free. So yeah it's true. It is limited.
And certainly the fact that it is not even 10 years old, they can't blame it on the fact that they had to figure out how to secure the rights for all of that music. They presumably were doing that as they were producing it. The big question, of course, is who are the producers and who controls it is unfortunately all too often one of the limiting factors as to why some really good TV shows, such as Bones, is not really seen the way you would expect it to, given how much money was poured into that series, how long it was out there, the production value of the Americans, the level of the performers, the writing, the accuracy, and the fact that it was so recognized by the awards community. Just sorry, listeners, if you've never seen it, you can love it. You can read Linda's book and maybe you'll get a glimpse of little bits of it, or just bite the bullet and buy some Amazon Prime for a while and find out that there's really good entertainment that is available. You just have to hunt for it. So Linda's book sort of captures some of that back stuff. It alludes briefly to Slate's podcast, because again, this was right from the people who were fresh from having produced it. They had a lot of stories to tell. And that's exciting that those podcasts are now really starting to become a staple. I would say that 5 years ago, it was a little unusual for there to be a podcast. I remember when Downton Abbey came up with it wasn't even really a podcast. It was more like a 10-minute audio interview with one of the major performers. Listeners, if you're not familiar with Wayne State Press's TV Milestone Series, it's actually a series of, they're almost like Cliff's Note size, 120 pages or so, but it is academic research. So Linda, tell us a little bit more about how it is then that you decided that your work on the Americans fit this format?
Oh, the TV Milestone series is designed for a larger audience. So they get scholars to write these books, those of us who really are willing to dig in and watch every episode and do some really in-depth analysis, but to write it for audiences who are not academics. So it's a lot of fun to write a book like this. They also want to keep it short. 100 pages is not very much. For me, it was really difficult to figure out what to include, what not to include. I wanted to focus on the women characters because they're extraordinary. You know, they're just extraordinary. So I have a chapter there. I also wanted to include the shocking use of children, the fact that this is family TV. And the use of children in the show is not romanticized at all. We meet a couple of young kids who had been recruited by the KGB and who are simply wrong. They're adolescents who are making very bad judgment calls. And we're kind of horrified that these kids have been recruited this way. But then this show also does something that I think is really tricky and also suggests just how nuanced it is. Young Paige is Elizabeth's daughter, and Elizabeth wants to recruit her into the KGB and does so. But we realize that Paige is recruitable because, okay, and this is pretty interesting. Paige has been recruited as an evangelical Christian. And she's recruited by somebody who sees that she's vulnerable and needs to belong somewhere. And of course, to have parents who are Soviets, who are communists, who believe that all religion is the opiate of the state, they are horrified that their daughter has become a born-again Christian. And the pastor, who is the recruiter, is a guy who's very kind to young people. Oh, there's nothing alarming about him. It's not like he has any kind of secret sexual agenda. He wants these kids to become socially conscious. He takes them to demonstrations, to anti-nuke demonstrations. We see Paige being caught up in this, but what we're realizing is that kids are recruitable. And the show is making a really kind of chilling expose of how we always recruit kids into ideologies. We always do. The politics of the parents are going to get picked up in some way by the kids. I can't think of another series that's willing to show the politics of this in such a shocking way as the Americans did.
And the ideology of Claudia and the fact that she goes back into the experiences of when she was a teenager and how that became so embedded in her life work of representing Russia and the pride, the patriotism.
Yeah, I mean, Claudia grew up through the war and so of course was recruited young. But we find out that Philip and Elizabeth, they were teenagers when they were recruited. But all of this made sense to them. Okay. And it's like, I can serve my country. I can do this. And so, I think it's interesting that we get this kind of insider view of what it's like to be inside Soviet ideology. On American television, are you kidding? I mean, the Claire Danes character in Homeland is shocking in many ways, but she's working for us, right? She's working for the cause that we understand. But one of the shocking things about the Americans is that these anti-heroes are working for the overthrow of the United States. I mean, really, how can we go for these people? They're tremendously attractive. We sympathize with them as parents. We see what they're going through, and we see what Elizabeth is going through and trying to be a working mother. She's working 2 jobs because Philip and Elizabeth do have a job. They're travel agents. So this is their excuse for they're on the phone all the time. They have to travel a lot. She's holding down this job, but she's also a full-time spy and she's a suburban mom to these kids. Yeah. I wanted to make sure that I covered that in the chapter, but I had to leave out a lot of things because it was only 100 pages. So for example, there's this wonderful character named Oleg who works for the KGB. He's in the Soviet embassy. He is one of the good KGB guys. And we get to see his family back in Moscow. He has a brother who dies in the Afghanistan war. We see the despair of the parents who don't get to talk about his death because the Soviets are playing down the losses that they've incurred in Afghanistan. And so we get this whole other kind of family melodrama that's out there. Well, all of this is fascinating. But Cynthia, I couldn't include this in the book. I just couldn't.
Right.
It was an entire character and an entire subplot that just couldn't fit into 100 pages. So there's lots of things for other scholars to do. I hope other people do a whole book on representations of the KGB, another whole book on uses of history, of how the series weaves in and out of real life Cold War history. Yeah. They're all things that I just couldn't cover in a book that was short and accessible. I'm also thinking of how the Americans treats the 1980s, because on the one hand, it's really kind of an expose of Reagan's family-friendly ideology. There's Reagan saying, family values, we got to do family values. Well, here's this family. It's a KGB family that looks like the family image that Reagan was promoting.
Mm-hmm.
What we see throughout the series, in fact, are a bunch of unhappy marriages and unhappy families. The series, I think, is critiquing that ideal of the American way is the family way. So, I mean, it's a critique of the 1980s. On the other hand, it loves the 1980s. I mean, going to vintage shops and looking for, for windbreakers from the era, going to great lengths to make scenes look like they came straight from MTV. The show both loves the 1980s and wants to critique it. It's certainly worth it, for those of us who lived through the 80s, to go back and look at it being recreated so faithfully.
And we're looking at it through wiser eyes, certainly, and with some guidance from a very capable and knowledgeable storyteller of Joe Weisberg. Wow. I will continue to methodically inch along through the Americans because I know that there's good storytelling there. It does leave me a little uncomfortable, I'll say. I don't like to think that my neighbors might still be leftovers from that program. But Linda, do you have other projects? Academics are busy all the time. So tell us what your title is at Ohio State University and what sort of work you do when you're not writing books.
Yeah, I'm a professor of women's gender sexuality studies. I'm very lucky that I get to teach film studies as part of my work. I mean, what a great job is that? I sometimes teach television when I'm teaching comedy. I've done a lot of work in comedy and analysis of comedy. I just finished a project on Carrie Fisher and Princess Leia. Looking at Carrie Fisher, especially her life as a comedian, she was a gifted comedian. Oh my gosh, she was brilliant. She did stand up, often talking with great frankness about her bipolar disorder and about her addictions, which were very interrelated because, like a lot of people with mental health problems, self-medicate with drugs and alcohol. And she talked about that and did comedy about that extensively. I'm now thinking about a project on stand-up comedy in relationship to mental health and addiction, because a lot of stand-up comedians have used stand-up comedy as a way to talk about both mental health problems and addiction. Maria Bamford is the one that comes to mind most obviously. Think of Robin Williams, Russell Brand, Stephen Fry. So I have a colleague here at the university. We're kind of thinking that we want to do an anthology to get a lot of people's thoughts on this, but we're also trying to figure out, why would stand-up comedy be a venue for people who are dealing with both mental illness and addiction? And we thought of a couple things. For one thing, people who are struggling with addiction have often been to 12-step meetings where a major strategy is you tell your story. And if you've ever been to a 12-step meeting, or if you ever know someone who's done so, I myself am in long-term sobriety. I'm 26 years sober, so I've been going to those meetings for a long, long time. We tell our stories over and over again. Telling the story is very powerful because it shapes your experience. It makes it meaningful. Stand-up comedians who are working with addiction problems have that model of, if you narrate your story, it means that you've put some kind of a shape to it. You're in control of the story because you can tell it. So I think that's one reason why, but Carrie Fisher, really good example of that. Another reason, I think, is that people with mental health problems frequently are not listened to, aren't taken seriously. With stand-up comedy, you're putting something out there as comedy. That is, we laugh at it. On some level, we're saying, well, we don't take this seriously. But you also have an audience. You have people who are listening. So I'm just beginning this project and just kind of wondering how this might take shape and thinking of some people who would be good topics for this project. But that's kind of what I'm doing next.
That sounds like a lot of fun. And I was just thinking a little bit about the most current season of Mrs. Maisel and the Lenny Bruce character, who is in as the name Lenny Bruce. It's not some sort of a cheap stand-in. A modern watcher, a 2022 watcher of Mrs. Maisel to even know who Lenny Bruce is. You'd have to be about 60 years old to know who Lenny Bruce really is.
Yeah, that series is wonderful for showing how stand-up can be a venue where women can speak out. It's also kind of a fantasy because in the 1950s, that was just about not possible. There were very few women doing stand-up comedy. And then the ones that did This is before your time. People like Phyllis Diller in the 1960s
Yeah.
were they did it by being very self-deprecating. Joan Rivers was certainly someone who was a groundbreaker there. But stand-up has always been a way for people to speak out and to say the unsayable. For a long time, only men could do that. So that might be a next project. Well, I'll tell you what, I want to put in a plug here for a book that just came out called The New Female Antihero. And it focuses on television. And it might be something for you to look at. And I think that your listeners would be really interested in this.
Okay.
But it takes on people like Olivia Pope in Scandal. It
Jessica
takes on Homeland,
Jones.
Homeland, The Americans. But it also includes comedy like Broad City. Women who are just bad, who just refuse to conform, who refuse to do the social role. So if you're interested in female anti-heroes on TV, it's a good book. It's by Sarah Hagelin, Hagelin, and Jillian Silberman.
All right.
The New Female Anti-Hero.
The New Female Anti-Hero. I did do one episode with another scholar who I met at a conference, and we talked in depth about Jessica Jones. But where the anti-hero or anti-heroine has come just since about 2010. Before that, TV did not really, there were just too many ways that TV required women to be likable. And it's taken this modern generation of feminism and the millennials in particular to sort of say, no, we don't need to smile. And in fact, we can be hard-edged, and it should be seen because women are doing it. We should be able to be represented on TV. So that does sound like a great book, and I will look into it. And listeners, you can look into it as well. And that link, as well as the link to the Americans book published by Wayne State University Press, will all appear in the show notes. Also, take a look over to tvherstory.com, which is where lots of other information about this podcast can be found. While you're at tvherstory.com, sign up for our e-newsletter. Seriously, if you get it monthly, it means that I'm staying on schedule. More likely, it's kind of every 6 weeks. And we don't advertise. Your email is kept safe. And we just want to continue sharing what it is we're working on with the podcast, what I'm doing in the offside for my book, what I'm reading, and what you guys are watching. So send your notes and thoughts regarding either this particular podcast and this great interview about the Americans with Linda Mijajewski. Stay in touch. We're also on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, but Advanced TV Herstory is here for you to continue talking about all that good TV from the past, but particularly who those women characters were and how it was that a great team such as that which worked on The Americans brought some incredible characters, like life-changing characters and life-changing storytelling to American women. So that's why we podcast here at Advanced TV Herstory. And I'm your host, Cynthia Bemis Abrams. Thanks for listening.